Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to deplane immediately. The captain said, his voice final. They saw a security concern, not a 19-year-old black student being publicly humiliated for no reason. As Marcus was escorted past a cabin of silent passengers, the crew believed they had solved a problem. They were oblivious to a crucial fact: they had just kicked the son of William Johnson, the founder and CEO of their airline, off his own father's plane. The phone call Marcus was about to make would not be a complaint. It would be a reckoning. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity, though in reality it lasted only seconds. When William Johnson finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled the calm before a storm. "Which airline?" he asked simply. Marcus swallowed hard, the bitter irony of the situation not lost on him. "Meridian Air Flight 2187 to Chicago." Another pause, longer this time. Marcus could almost see his father straightening in his chair, 60 mirror away, in the penthouse office that overlooked the sprawling headquarters of the very airline that had just humiliated his son. "Stay where you are," William said finally, his voice taking on the steel edge that had made him one of the most respected and feared CEOs in the aviation industry. "I'm coming." Marcus ended the call and slumped against the cold terminal wall, unaware that the events of the next 24 hours would shake Meridian Air to its foundation force, a national conversation about bias and prejudice, and forever change the lives of everyone involved in the incident. From the flight attendant who had first raised concerns to the security officers who had removed him to the pilot who had made the final call. But to understand how Marcus Johnson found himself standing alone in Terminal C with his belongings hastily shoved into his backpack and the lingering stares of former fellow passengers burning into his back, we need to go back to where it all began, 3 hours earlier. Marcus had arrived at gate C4292 minutes before departure, just as his father had always taught him. Punctuality is professionalism, William would say. One of the many mantras that had built Meridian Air from a regional carrier into the nation's 5th largest airline. At 19, Marcus had heard these maxims his entire life, though he'd spent the last few years doing his best to forge his own path, separate from his father's long shadow. It was why he'd chosen Westlake University, a small liberal arts college in Chicago, rather than Harvard Business School, where generations of Johnsons had studied. It was why he was flying commercial today instead of taking the company jet. And it was why his reservation was under Marcus Johnson, with no special designations or markers that might identify him as the son of William Johnson, founder and CEO of Meridian Air. He checked in at the kiosk, his fingers moving automatically across the screen as he confirmed his seat assignment. 14A, a window seat. He travelled light with just a carry-on backpack containing his laptop, a dog-eared copy of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time headphones, and a change of clothes. The start of his sophomore year was still 3 weeks away, but Marcus had volunteered to help with freshman orientation. It was the kind of program he wished he'd had when he first arrived on campus. Someone to show him the ropes, someone who looked like him. As he settled into one of the molded plastic chairs at the gate, Marcus observed his fellow passengers, a young mother trying to soothe a fussy toddler, an elderly couple sharing sections of a newspaper, a group of businessmen in nearly identical suits, their voices a low murmur of market forecasts and quarterly projections. Marcus pulled out his book, losing himself in Baldwin's powerful prose as the gate area gradually filled. He was so engrossed that he almost missed the first boarding announcement. Attention passengers on Meridian Air Flight 2187 with service to Chicago O'Hare. We will now begin boarding with our Platinum Elite members and passengers requiring special assistance. Marcus gathered his belongings and moved toward the back of the boarding line. He was in Group 3, which would be called shortly. He thumbed through his phone, responding to a text from his roommate Devon about their plans for the weekend. Group 3 now. Boarding through Lane 2, the gate agent announced, and Marcus stepped forward, boarding pass and ID in hand. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with auburn hair pulled back in a tight bun, glanced at his documents and then up at his face, her expression flickering momentarily before she scanned his boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Johnson," she said, handing back his ID. Marcus nodded his thanks and proceeded down the jetway. As he approached the aircraft door, he was greeted by a flight attendant named Heather, according to her name tag. She was perhaps in her early 50s with blonde hair and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome aboard," she said, stepping slightly to the side as Marcus passed. He made his way down the narrow aisle, counting rows, until he reached 14A. A middle-aged white man already occupied the aisle seat, his substantial frame spilling slightly over the armrest. The middle seat remained empty, a small blessing on what appeared to be a full flight. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely. The man looked up from his phone, his expression neutral as he unbuckled and stood to let Marcus through. Marcus slid into the window seat, stowing his backpack under the seat in front of him. "Thanks," he said, buckling his seatbelt. The man merely nodded, returning his attention to his phone. Marcus gazed out the window at the ground crew loading luggage into the belly of the aircraft. The familiar sights of the airport, the choreographed movement of support vehicles, the distant taxiing of aircraft had once filled him with a sense of pride. His father had built this, had transformed a struggling regional carrier into a powerhouse that connected cities across the nation. As a child, Marcus had loved visiting the headquarters, sitting in his father's leather chair, and playing with model airplanes. But as he'd grown older, that pride had become complicated, tangled up with his desire for independence and his growing awareness of being a black man in America. His thoughts were interrupted as the middle seat was claimed by a woman in her 60s, her silver hair cut in a stylish bob. She settled in with a paperback novel and a small pillow for her neck. "Hello," she said cheerfully. "Looks like we'll be neighbors for the next couple of hours." Marcus smiled. "Looks that way." "Heading to Chicago for business or pleasure?" She asked, arranging her belongings. "School." Marcus replied, "I attend Westlake University." "Oh, wonderful," the woman exclaimed. "My niece graduated from there 3 years ago. English literature major." "What are you studying?" "Political science with a minor in African American studies," he said. "Fascinating," she said. "I'm Elena, by the way, Marcus," he replied, offering his hand, which she shook warmly. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a harried-looking man who took the aisle seat across from them. He had barely settled when Heather, the flight attendant who had greeted Marcus at the door, approached their row. "Excuse me, sir," she said, addressing Marcus. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Marcus frowned slightly, but reached for his phone, pulling up the digital boarding pass. "Is there a problem?" Heather glanced at the screen, then back at Marcus. "And may I see your ID as well, please?" Marcus felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a sensation he had experienced many times before. In upscale stores, when security followed him a little too closely during traffic stops, when officers asked if the car he was driving was his. In classroom discussions when his comments were scrutinized more rigorously than those of his white classmates. He produced his driver's license, aware that other passengers were now watching the interaction with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. Heather studied his ID carefully, looking between the photo and his face several times. "And what's the purpose of your trip to Chicago today, Mr. Johnson?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Marcus was acutely aware that no other passengers had been subjected to this additional screening after boarding. "I'm a student at Westlake University," he answered calmly, though he could feel heat rising in his face. "I'm returning for orientation." Ella shifted uncomfortably beside him. "He was just telling me about his studies," she offered. "Political science." Heather barely acknowledged Elena's comment. "One moment, please," she said before moving toward the front of the aircraft. "That was odd," Elena murmured. Marcus said nothing, staring straight ahead, trying to ignore the curious glances from nearby passengers. He had learned long ago that showing anger, even justified anger, would only reinforce stereotypes. So he sat still, his face a careful mask of neutrality, even as his thoughts raced. Minutes passed before Heather returned this time, accompanied by a male flight attendant, and the captain, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and the confident bearing of someone used to command. "Sir," the captain said, his voice pitched low, but still audible to those in nearby seats. "There seems to be a concern about your boarding verification. I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and come with me." Marcus felt as though the air had been sucked from his lungs. What concern I showed my boarding pass and ID. The captain glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. "Please, sir, let's discuss this off the aircraft." "I don't understand." Marcus persisted. "I have a valid ticket. I'm in my assigned seat. What's the problem?" By now, the cabin had grown quiet, with passengers straining to hear the exchange. Elena spoke up again, her voice quavering slightly. "Excuse me, Captain. This young man has done nothing wrong. We were just having a pleasant conversation about his university." The captain addressed Elena with practiced diplomacy. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but this is a security matter that we need to address." Marcus felt a surge of indignation. A security matter based on what the captain's expression hardened slightly. "Sir, I need you to comply with my request to deplane immediately, or I will be forced to call security." Marcus looked around at the faces watching him. Some curious, some uncomfortable, some deliberately looking away. In that moment, he had a choice. Continue to resist and risk escalation, or comply under protest. With a silent prayer for strength, he chose the latter. "I'll go," he said quietly, "but I want it on record that I'm being removed without cause." He gathered his backpack, careful not to make any sudden movements. Elena touched his arm gently. "This isn't right," she whispered. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement as he edged past her and the man in the aisle seat, who now avoided eye contact entirely. As he followed the captain up the aisle, he felt the weight of dozens of stares on his back. The shame was almost physical, a burning sensation that spread across his skin, despite his knowledge that he had done nothing wrong. At the aircraft door, 2 security officers were waiting. They flanked him as he walked up the jetway, not touching him but close enough to intervene if necessary. The humiliation intensified with each step. Back in the terminal, the captain turned to address him directly. "Mr. Johnson, one of our flight attendants raised concerns about the authenticity of your boarding documentation. We take security very seriously at Meridian Air." "What specifically raised concerns?" Marcus asked, fighting to keep his voice level. The captain hesitated. There was a discrepancy that needed verification. What discrepancy? Marcus pressed. The captain exchanged glances with the security officers. "Your boarding pass indicates you purchased this ticket yesterday, but you're claiming to be returning to school. Additionally, you had minimal luggage for a student supposedly going back for a term." Marcus stared in disbelief. "So because I packed light and bought my ticket recently, you assumed I was what? Using a fake ID, trying to hijack the plane. Sir, please lower your voice," one of the security officers warned. Marcus took a deep breath. "I bought the ticket yesterday because my plans changed. I'm helping with freshman orientation, which starts earlier than regular classes, and I packed light because I already have clothes and supplies at my apartment in Chicago." "We'll need to verify your enrollment status with the university," the captain said. "Fine," Marcus replied, pulling out his student ID. "Call them, check my registration status, do whatever you need to do, but I have a right to know if there were other factors in your decision." The captain's expression remained impassive. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Johnson." "I think you know exactly what I'm implying," Marcus said quietly. "Was anyone else on that flight subjected to this kind of scrutiny after boarding, or was it just the black passenger in 14A? The question hung in the air unanswered. The security officers shifted uncomfortably. "We'll need some time to complete our verification," the captain finally said. "Your flight will be departing shortly. If everything checks out, we'll rebook you on the next available flight to Chicago." And with that, the captain returned to the aircraft, leaving Marcus with the security officers and a customer service representative who had just arrived at the gate. "I can help you over here, Mr. Johnson," the representative said, gesturing toward the desk. As Marcus followed her, he could see through the large windows as his flight began to push back from the gate without him. He watched as the aircraft taxied away, carrying Elena and the other passengers who had witnessed his humiliation to Chicago without incident. It was only then, standing alone at the customer service desk, that Marcus reached for his phone and called his father. William Johnson ended the call with his son and sat motionless behind his desk for several long moments, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just heard. At 62, William had built Meridian Air from nearly nothing, turning a small charter service with 2 propeller planes into a major carrier with a fleet of over 200 aircraft. He had navigated fuel crises, economic downturns, and the industry-shattering aftermath of 9/11. He had created a corporate culture that prided itself on safety, efficiency, and customer service. And now his son, his only child, had been profiled and removed from one of his own planes. William's large corner office offered panoramic views of the Meridian Air corporate campus with its modern buildings and the constant movement of employee shuttles. Awards and recognitions lined the walls along with models of the various aircraft in their fleet. On his desk sat 2 photographs. One of his late wife Patricia, taken a year before cancer took her from them when Marcus was just 10. The other of Marcus in his high school graduation cap and gown, his smile so like his mother's that it sometimes made William's chest ache to look at it. He swiveled his chair to face the wall of windows, his reflection ghostly against the bright afternoon sky. William Johnson was not a man who raised his voice or made threats. His anger when it came was cold and deliberate, all the more dangerous for its precision. He pressed the intercom button on his desk phone. "Diane, I need you to clear my schedule for the rest of the day, then get me on the next flight to Reagan National. Use my private credentials, not the executive code." "Yes, Mr. Johnson," his executive assistant replied. "May I tell the board members why you're canceling the budget review meeting family emergency?" he said simply. "Is everything all right with Marcus, Diane?" Asked concern evident in her voice. She had been with William for 15 years and had watched Marcus grow up. "No," William replied, "but it will be. Also, I need you to pull all information on Flight 2187 to Chicago. Passenger manifest, crew list, captain's name, everything. And, Diane, do it discreetly. I don't want anyone to know I'm looking into this specific flight. Understood. I'll have a car waiting for you downstairs in 15 minutes." William ended the call and opened his desk drawer, removing a small leather-bound journal that Patricia had given him the year they were married. Inside, in neat handwriting, were the core principles he had established when founding the airline. Principles he had tried to instill in every employee, from baggage handlers to executives. Safety, integrity, respect, excellence, accountability. He ran his finger over the last word, feeling the slight indentation in the paper. Accountability. Someone would be held accountable for what had happened to his son today. But first, he needed to understand exactly what had transpired. William closed the journal and placed it in his briefcase along with his laptop. He checked his watch, a vintage Rolex that had been a gift from Patricia, and calculated that he could be in DC within 3 hours. Marcus would have to wait a little longer, but William wanted to handle this in person. Some situations demanded the physical presence of power, not just its voice over a telephone line. As he prepared to leave, his phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Flight info sent to your secure email. Car arriving in 10. Marcus was scheduled on 2187, but no longer showing on passenger manifest. Captain Robert Whitman, Chief F.A. Heather Davis." William committed the names to memory. Robert Whitman, Heather Davis. By this time tomorrow, they would understand the gravity of their error, not because they had unwittingly humiliated the son of the company's owner. William had never used his position for personal vendettas, but because they had violated the core principles upon which he had built Meridian Air. As he rode the private elevator down to the executive garage, William thought about his son. Marcus had always been determined to make his own way, refusing special treatment or the shortcuts his father's position might have afforded him. It was a quality William respected deeply, even when it meant Marcus took a harder path than necessary. William had been proud when Marcus chose Westlake over Harvard, seeing it as evidence of his son's independence and commitment to his own values. He had respected Marcus's decision to fly commercial instead of using the company jet. understanding his desire to experience the world on its own terms rather than from the cushioned perspective of privilege. But there was a bitter irony in the fact that Marcus's determination to stand on his own merits had left him vulnerable to the very prejudice and discrimination that William had fought against, albeit sometimes imperfectly, throughout his career. The elevator doors opened to reveal a black Audi sedan, waiting in the reserved space nearest the door. The driver, a former Air Force officer named Jackson, who had worked for William for nearly a decade, stood at attention beside the vehicle. "Reagan National, sir?" he asked as William approached. "Yes, and we'll need to make good time, Jackson." "Understood, sir." As they pulled away from the Meridian Air Headquarters, William made one more call to Richard Chen, the company's chief legal counsel, and one of the few people William considered a true friend. "Richard, I need you to meet me in DC tonight," William said when the attorney answered. "We have a situation that requires your expertise." "Of course," Richard replied without hesitation. "Is this about the quarterly SEC filing?" "No, this is personal, but with potential implications for the company. I'll brief you fully when you arrive. Can you be there by 8? I'll make it happen." Richard assured him. "Where should I meet you? The Georgetown house. And Richard, come alone and keep this between us for now. Always William. See you tonight." William ended the call and gazed out the window as the car merged onto the highway. The sprawling city fell away behind them, the Meridian Air Headquarters growing smaller in the distance. He thought again of Marcus standing alone in the terminal, humiliated and angry. William had always taught his son about dignity, about holding his head high in a world that would often try to make him lower it. Today, that dignity had been assaulted, and William felt a surge of the protective instinct he had first experienced when holding his newborn son in his arms 19 years ago. But mixed with that instinct was something else, annoying question about his own responsibility and what had happened. Had he done enough to address the systemic biases that might exist within his own company? Had he been too focused on metrics and market share, and not enough on the human elements that truly defined an organization's character? As the car accelerated toward the airport, William Johnson made a silent promise not just to his son, but to himself. This incident would be addressed, yes, but beyond that, it would become a catalyst for change. The company he had built would either live up to its stated principles, or he would reshape it until it did. Back at Reagan National Airport, Marcus sat in an uncomfortable chair at Gate C-42, watching as a new group of passengers began to gather for the next flight to Chicago. After his father's call, he had declined the customer service representative's offer to rebook him immediately. Better to wait to see what his father had in mind before making any decisions. The representative, a woman named Tanya, with kind eyes and a concerned expression, had been apologetic but vague about the reason for his removal. "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Johnson," she had said. "I can see here that there was a security verification needed, but it appears to have been resolved. We can get you on the 4:45 flight to Chicago, if that works for you." And what exactly was this security verification?" Marcus had pressed. Tanya had glanced uncomfortably at her screen. "I don't have the specific details in my system, just that it was resolved and you're cleared to travel." Marcus had declined the immediate rebooking, saying he needed to arrange some things and would let her know his plans shortly. Now he sat watching the rhythms of the airport, the hurried business travelers, the families corralling children and luggage, the airport staff going about their duties with practiced efficiency. His phone buzzed with a text from Devon. "Did you make your flight? On my way to pick you up?" Marcus hesitated before replying. "Slight change of plans. We'll explain later. Don't come to airport yet." Devon's response came quickly. "Everything okay, man? Dealing with some BS. We'll call you tonight." Marcus texted back. He pocketed his phone and returned to watching the gate area. His thoughts drifting to his father. William Johnson was a man of careful words and deliberate actions. Growing up, Marcus had sometimes found his father's measured approach frustrating, especially during his teenage years when emotions ran hot and immediate action seemed the only appropriate response to perceived injustice. There's productive anger and destructive anger. William had told him once, after Marcus had gotten into a heated argument with a teacher who had suggested that affirmative action was the primary reason Marcus had been accepted to several prestigious universities. Productive anger fuels change. Destructive anger just burns bridges you might need later. Marcus had carried that lesson with him to college, channeling his frustration with systemic inequality into political activism and community organizing rather than confrontation for its own sake. But today, sitting in the airport after being publicly humiliated, Marcus found it difficult to access that productive anger. The shame and indignation were too raw, too personal. His thoughts were interrupted by the appearance of the same flight attendant, Heather, who had first questioned his documentation on the plane. She was walking briskly through the terminal, her uniform neat and her posture erect. She hadn't noticed him sitting there slightly obscured by a pillar. Without fully considering his actions, Marcus stood and stepped into her path. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice calmer than he felt. Heather stopped abruptly, recognition and then alarm flashing across her face. "Yes," she said, her voice tight. "I wanted to ask you something." Marcus continued maintaining a respectful distance. "Why did you single me out on that flight? What made you question my documentation after I had already been cleared to board?" Heather glanced around as if looking for backup. "Sir, I was just following protocol. There was a discrepancy that needed to be addressed." "What discrepancy?" Marcus pressed, echoing the question he had asked the captain earlier. "I'm not at liberty to discuss security procedures," she replied stiffly. "If you have concerns about your experience, I suggest you contact customer relations." "I'm not asking about security procedures," Marcus said. "I'm asking why you personally decided I needed additional scrutiny when no one else on that flight did." A flash of discomfort crossed Heather's face. "It wasn't personal. It felt very personal from where I was sitting," Marcus countered. "Being removed from a flight in front of a plane full of people who look at you like you're a threat. That's about as personal as it gets." Heather's expression hardened. "I'm sorry you feel that way, but I have a job to do. If you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for my next flight." As she attempted to move past him, Marcus spoke again, his voice still level, but carrying an edge that made her pause. "You know what the worst part was," he said. "It wasn't the embarrassment or even the inconvenience. It was watching how quickly everyone accepted that I must have done something wrong. How easily they believed I didn't belong there." Heather's eyes met his briefly, and for a moment Marcus thought he saw a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or discomfort, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I need to go," she said, and hurried away, without looking back. Marcus watched her disappear into the crowd, a mixture of frustration and weariness settling over him. He had hoped for what an admission, an apology, some acknowledgement of the impact of her actions. Whatever he had been seeking, it was clear he wouldn't find it in that conversation. He returned to his seat, pulling out his copy of Baldwin to pass the time until his father arrived. The words written decades ago resonated with a painful timeliness. To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all of the time. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, feeling the truth of those words in his bones. Then he opened them, straightened his shoulders, and continued reading, losing himself in Baldwin's unflinching examination of America's racial realities. Realities that, despite the passage of time, still shaped his life in ways both subtle and profound. Captain Robert Wittman completed his post-flight checks with the same methodical precision he applied to all aspects of his job. 23 years with Meridian Air 18 as a captain with a perfect safety record, and commendations for his leadership during several in-flight emergencies. He took pride in his professionalism, in the respect he commanded from his crew, and in his unwavering commitment to passenger safety. Today's flight had proceeded without incident after the departure from DC, but Wittman couldn't quite shake an uneasy feeling about the decision to remove the young man in 14A. The flight attendant's concerns had seemed legitimate at the time, a last-minute ticket purchase, minimal luggage for a supposed return to university, and what she had described as nervous behavior. But in retrospect, the evidence seemed thin especially given the young man's calm demeanor and willingness to provide identification. As Whitman signed the final paperwork in the Flight Operations Office at O'Hare First Officer, Melissa Sanchez approached her uniform crisp despite the long day. "Everything squared away, Captain." She asked, her tone professional but friendly. At 34, Sanchez was one of Meridian's youngest first officers on international routes with a reputation for exceptional flying skills and a calm demeanor. "Just finishing up," Whitman replied. "You headed home? Or staying overnight?" "Staying. I've got the Madrid flight tomorrow." She hesitated, then added, "Can I ask you something about what happened back in DC with the passenger we removed?" Whitman stiffened slightly, but nodded. "Go ahead. Was there something I missed?" "Some security concern beyond what was communicated to the cockpit." Whitman considered his response carefully. Heather reported concerns about documentation, irregularities, and suspicious behavior. Given the information available at the time I made the call, I thought was appropriate. Sanchez nodded slowly. "It's just, I've never seen a passenger removed for documentation issues after they've already cleared the gate. Usually that's caught during boarding." It was an unusual situation, Whitman acknowledged. "But irregular boarding activities are a potential security indicator. We can't be too careful." Of course, Sanchez said, "Safety first, always." She gathered her flight bag, preparing to leave. "Will there be any follow-up with the passenger? I mean, customer relations will handle any complaints." Whitman replied, his tone indicating the conversation was over. "Have a good flight tomorrow, Melissa." "Thanks, Captain. You too." As Sanchez departed, Whitman found himself replaying the incident again in his mind. Had he acted too hastily, should he have questioned Heather's assessment more thoroughly before making the decision to remove the passenger? His phone buzzed with a notification from the company's scheduling system. He pulled it up, expecting to see details of his next assignment. Instead, there was a message requesting his presence at Meridian's Chicago offices the following morning at 9:00 a.m. for an operational review meeting. Whitman frowned. Operational reviews typically happened on a quarterly basis, not randomly in the middle of a rotation. He was due to captain a return flight to DC tomorrow afternoon, who would be taking that assignment if he was in meetings. He typed a quick query to scheduling asking for clarification on the flight assignment. The response came almost immediately. "Captain Whitman, your flight tomorrow has been reassigned. Please report to Suite 450 at CHQ at 9:00 as directed. This is a priority meeting. All other inquiries should be directed to Chief Pilot's office. Thank you." The formality of the message set off warning bells in Whitman's mind. In all his years with Meridian, he had never been pulled from a flight assignment for an unscheduled meeting. Something was happening, and he had a sinking feeling it was connected to the incident with the young man in 14A. He gathered his belongings and headed for the hotel shuttle, his earlier confidence giving way to a growing sense of apprehension. Whatever was waiting for him tomorrow morning, Robert Whitman had a feeling it would be unlike any operational review he had experienced before. Elena Bennett couldn't stop thinking about the young man who had been removed from the flight. Throughout the journey to Chicago, she had replayed the scene in her mind, his dignified composure in the face of obvious humiliation, the murmurs and averted gazes of the other passengers, the flight attendant's rigid expression as she escorted him away. As a retired high school principal from Vermont, Elena had spent decades advocating for her students, particularly those who faced discrimination and prejudice. She had prided herself on creating an environment where all students felt valued and respected, where incidents of bias were addressed promptly and directly. And yet today, when faced with a clear injustice, she had managed only a few ineffectual protests before falling silent watching as a young man was marched off the plane for no apparent reason other than the color of his skin. Now settled in her daughter's guest room in the Chicago suburbs, Elena felt the weight of her inadequate response. She had always told her students that being an ally meant speaking up when it mattered, not just in the safety of classrooms and diversity workshops. Today, she had failed to live up to her own standards. Her daughter Sarah entered the room with a cup of tea. "You're quiet tonight, Mom. Everything okay?" Elena accepted the tea gratefully. I witnessed something troubling on the flight, and I can't seem to shake it. She recounted the incident to Sarah, her voice growing more distressed as she described Marcus's removal from the plane. The worst part is, I knew it was wrong. I could see exactly what was happening, and I said almost nothing. Elena concluded, just a few token objections, and then I let them take him away. Sarah sat beside her mother on the edge of the bed. That sounds awful. Did you get his name? Maybe you could report what you saw to the airline. Marcus, Elena said. His name was Marcus. He was studying political science at Westlake University. She set down her tea. And yes, I think I need to do more than just feel guilty about this. I need to speak up. You always taught us to stand up for what's right, Sarah reminded her. Even when it's uncomfortable. Elena nodded a plan forming in her mind. I'm going to call the airline first thing tomorrow, and if that doesn't work, I'll reach out to Westlake University. Maybe they can help me contact him directly. Do you think that's appropriate? Sarah asked. Tracking him down like that? Elena considered the question seriously. I'm not sure, but I know that staying silent feels wrong. That young man deserves an apology from the airline, certainly, but also from passengers like me who saw what was happening and didn't do enough to stop it. She picked up her phone and opened the Meridian Air app, navigating to the customer service section. There was an option to provide feedback about a recent flight experience. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Elena began typing her account of what had happened, she made a silent promise to the young man named Marcus. This time, she wouldn't be a passive witness to injustice. This time, she would make her voice heard. If you're watching this video right now, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to see more compelling stories like this one. Your support helps us bring these important narratives to light. Now let's get back to Marcus and his father, as this situation continues to unfold. William Johnson arrived at Reagan National Airport shortly after 7:00 p.m., having used the company's private terminal to avoid delays. He had spent the flight reviewing the information Diane had sent the crew manifest for Flight 2187, the passenger list, and the scant details available about the incident involving Marcus. The official report filed by Captain Whitman cited security concerns regarding passenger documentation and behaviour as the reason for removal. No specific behaviours were detailed, no concrete discrepancies identified. It was the kind of vague justification that William had seen countless times over his decades in the industry. Language designed to cover all bases without committing to any specific allegation that might later be challenged. As his private car pulled up to the main terminal, William texted Marcus, "I'm here. Where are you?" The response came immediately. Gate C42, same one I was supposed to depart from earlier. William directed the driver to the departures level and made his way through the terminal with the confident stride of a man accustomed to navigating both airports and corporate power structures with equal ease. Despite his casual clothing, he had changed from his business suit into jeans and a polo shirt on the plane. There was an unmistakable air of authority about him that caused people to move out of his path instinctively. He spotted Marcus before his son saw him sitting alone near a pillar reading. The sight sent a pang through William's chest. Marcus had Patricia's eyes and her thoughtful expression when engrossed in a book, but he had William's height and build, his strong jawline and commanding presence. At 19, he was already a striking young man with a kind of quiet confidence that couldn't be taught. William approached, and Marcus looked up, relief washing over his features as he stood to greet his father. "Dad," he said, simply accepting William's embrace. They held the hug a moment longer than usual, both men drawing strength from the contact before pulling apart. "Are you okay?" William asked, scrutinizing his son's face. "I'm fine," Marcus assured him, though the tightness around his eyes suggested otherwise. "Just angry and tired." William nodded, understanding more than Marcus might realize. "Let's get out of here. We can talk at the house." As they walked toward the exit, William was acutely aware of the sidelong glances they received. A tall, distinguished older black man and a younger version of himself moving with purpose through the crowded terminal. He wondered how many of these same people had witnessed Marcus's humiliation earlier in the day. How many had watched in silence as his son was escorted off that plane? Once in the car, Marcus seemed to relax slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing as they pulled away from the airport. "I spoke to Richard Chen," William said as they merged onto the highway. "He's meeting us at the Georgetown house tonight." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You called the company lawyer." "This isn't just about what happened to you, Marcus. It's about Meridian Air and what it stands for." William paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But first, I need to hear everything exactly as it happened from the moment you arrived at the airport." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus recounted the day's events in detail. The check-in process, boarding, the initial questioning from Heather, the captain's intervention, and finally, the humiliating walk back up the jetway under the watchful eyes of security. William listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When Marcus described his confrontation with Heather after the flight's departure, William's lips pressed into a thin line, the only visible sign of his mounting anger. "She wouldn't even acknowledge what she'd done," Marcus concluded. "Acted like it was just standard procedure, like I should understand why being black made me more suspicious than everyone else on that plane." William was silent for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. "I'm proud of you," he finally said. "You handled yourself with dignity in an impossible situation." Marcus looked out the window at the passing cityscape. "What choice did I have? If I'd gotten angry, raised my voice, then I would have just confirmed their assumptions. Just another angry black man causing trouble." The bitterness in his son's voice pierced William's heart. It was a reality he had hoped, perhaps naively, that Marcus might somehow be spared, despite his own experiences with prejudice throughout his career. "Your mother would be proud too," William said softly. "She always said you had more grace under pressure than either of us." Marcus smiled faintly at the mention of Patricia. "I'm not feeling very graceful right now, Dad. I'm feeling like I want someone to answer for what happened today." "They will," William assured him. "Starting tomorrow. But first we need to be strategic about how we approach this." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. William considered how much to share. For years he had tried to shield Marcus from the uglier aspects of corporate politics and power struggles, but his son was no longer a child, and this situation had thrust him directly into those treacherous waters. Meridian Air is a publicly traded company with shareholders, a board of directors, and a corporate reputation to protect, William explained. "If we handle this wrong, the company's first instinct will be damage control. Issuing a bland apology, offering compensation, and burying the incident as quickly as possible." "Isn't that what usually happens?" Marcus asked. "A company messes up, says sorry, maybe fires someone as a scapegoat, and everything goes back to normal until the next incident." "Usually, yes," William acknowledged. "But this time is different. Because I'm your son." Marcus said, a hint of resignation in his voice. Partly, William admitted, but more importantly, because this incident exposes something fundamental about Meridian's culture and practices, something I should have been paying closer attention to long before it affected you personally. They pulled up to William's townhouse, an elegant brick building with a small manicured front garden. It was William's DC residence, used primarily during meetings with government officials and regulatory agencies. Marcus had visited many times over the years, but had never stayed there for more than a night or two. As they entered, William checked his watch. "Richard will be here in about an hour. Why don't you get settled in while I make some calls? Your usual room is ready." Marcus nodded and headed upstairs with his backpack, leaving William alone in the study. He poured himself a small glass of bourbon, his first drink of the day, and sat heavily in the leather chair behind his desk. On the wall opposite hung a large framed photograph of Meridian Air's original 2 aircraft on the tarmac of a small regional airport. William and Patricia stood between them, young and beaming with optimism, their dreams of building something significant still ahead of them. Patricia had been his co-founder in every sense, bringing her financial acumen and strategic thinking to complement his operational knowledge and industry connections. "What would you do, Patty?" he murmured to the photograph. "How would you handle this?" The answer came to him almost immediately, as if she had whispered it in his ear. Patricia had always been the moral compass of their partnership, the one who insisted that their company would be different, more humane, more ethical, more just. William pulled out his phone and dialed a number he rarely used but had never forgotten. After 3 rings, a deep voice answered, "This is Michael Robinson." "Michael, it's William Johnson." A pause, then William. "It's been a while." "Too long," William agreed. "I need your help with something important." Michael Robinson had been Meridian's head of human resources during its early growth phase, helping to build the company's culture and hiring practices. He had departed 10 years ago after increasingly vocal disagreements with the board about diversity initiatives and employee treatment. Since then, he had founded a consulting firm specializing in corporate ethics and diversity training. "I'm listening," Michael said. For the next 15 minutes, William outlined what had happened to Marcus and his preliminary thoughts on how to address it. Michael listened without interruption, asking clarifying questions only when William had finished. "So, you want to use this incident as a catalyst for systemic change within Meridian?" Michael summarized, "Not just discipline the individuals involved." "Exactly," William confirmed. "This goes beyond a single flight crew making a bad call. If this could happen to my son on my airline, then something is fundamentally broken in our culture and training." "You do realize you're talking about a massive undertaking," Michael cautioned. "The kind of change you're describing doesn't happen overnight, and it will face resistance at every level." "I'm prepared for that," William said firmly. "Are you?" Michael challenged. "Because once you start this process, there's no going back. You'll be asking people to confront their biases, examine their privileges, and change behaviors they don't even recognize as problematic. That's uncomfortable work, William. People resist discomfort. Let them resist," William replied, an edge of steel in his voice. "Meridian Air is still my company. The board can advise, but major operational and cultural decisions are ultimately mine to make." Michael was silent for a moment. "What about Marcus? What role does he want in all this?" It was a good question, one William realized he hadn't fully considered. "I don't know yet. We haven't discussed it. You should," Michael advised. "Before you launch any initiative in his name, make sure it's aligned with what he wants. He's a young man who just experienced something traumatic. His needs matter here too." William nodded, even though Michael couldn't see him. "You're right. I'll talk to him tonight." "Good. And William, it's not lost on me that it took something happening to your own son for you to call me after all these years." The observation stung, but William couldn't deny its truth. "I should have listened to you a decade ago, Michael. I see that now. Better late than never." Michael said, his tone softening slightly. "Send me the details of when and where you want to meet. I'll clear my schedule." After ending the call, William sat in contemplative silence until the doorbell announced Richard Chen's arrival. As he rose to greet his legal counsel and friend, William felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and difficult conversations, but tonight was about strategy and preparation. The path ahead would not be easy, but William Johnson had never shied away from a challenge, especially one that mattered as much as this. Across town, in a modern high-rise apartment building, Heather Davis kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto her sofa, mentally exhausted from the day's events. Her uniform jacket hung neatly over a chair, her flight bag placed precisely by the door, ready for tomorrow's assignment. 22 years as a flight attendant had taught Heather to compartmentalize, to separate the stresses of work from her personal life, to maintain a professional demeanor regardless of circumstances. But today's incident with the young man in 14A had followed her home, lingering in her thoughts despite her best efforts to dismiss it. His words during their second encounter kept replaying in her mind. "It was watching how quickly everyone accepted that I must have done something wrong. How easily they believed I didn't belong there." Heather poured herself a glass of wine and carried it to the window overlooking the city lights. Had she been wrong to flag him for additional screening? The initial concerns had seemed valid. The last-minute ticket purchase, his minimal luggage, what she had perceived as nervous behavior. But in retrospect, had she interpreted his actions differently because of his race? Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Megan, a senior at NYU. "How was your day, Mum? Still on for Zoom dinner tomorrow?" Heather smiled reflexively at her daughter's message. "Long day. Definitely still on for tomorrow. Can't wait to hear about your internship interview." She set the phone down and took a long sip of wine. Heather had raised Megan alone after her husband's death 15 years ago, working extra shifts and holiday rotations to ensure her daughter could attend the best schools and pursue her dreams. She had taught Megan to be kind, to work hard, to judge people by their character rather than their appearance. And yet today, her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Robert Whitman, the captain from today's flight. "Hello," she answered. "Heather, it's Bob. Sorry to call so late. It's fine. Is everything okay?" There was a slight hesitation before he replied. "I've been called in for an operational review meeting tomorrow morning at CHQ. They've pulled me from my flight assignment." Heather felt a flutter of anxiety. That's unusual. Did they say what it's about? "No, but I think it might be about what happened with that passenger today. The timing is suspicious, but we followed protocol." Heather said as much to reassure herself as him. "You made the final decision based on the information I provided. I know Whitman agreed, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Have you received any communication about a meeting?" Heather checked her company email on her tablet. "Nothing so far. I'm scheduled for the Chicago to Atlanta route tomorrow. We'll keep an eye out. And Heather, if you are called in, just stick to the facts. We had security concerns. We acted on them. Period." After ending the call, Heather's unease intensified. In all her years with Meridian, she had never known a captain to be pulled from rotation for an unscheduled operational review. Something was happening, and she had a sinking feeling it was connected to the young man she had reported. She opened her company email again and began composing a detailed account of the incident, recording her observations and actions as precisely as possible. If there was going to be an investigation, she wanted her version of events documented clearly. As she typed, Heather tried to ignore the small voice inside her that questioned her motivations, that wondered if she would have raised the same concerns about a young white passenger in similar circumstances. That voice had grown louder since her encounter with Marcus in the terminal, and no amount of procedural justification seemed to silence it completely. She finished her report and sent it to herself as documentation, then closed her laptop and returned to the window. Below, the city continued its nightly rhythm, oblivious to the small drama that had played out on Flight 2187. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. Tonight, Heather Davis would try to sleep, though she suspected rest would prove elusive. The following morning dawned clear and bright in Washington, D.C. In William Johnson's Georgetown house, 3 men sat around the dining room table. Papers and tablets spread before them as they finalized their approach to the day ahead. William, dressed in one of his finest suits, studied a document Richard had prepared outlining the legal implications of various courses of action. Across from him, Richard Chen, Meridian's chief legal counsel, reviewed his notes from their late-night strategy session. And beside William sat Marcus, who had ultimately decided to accompany his father to Chicago after a long conversation about what they hoped to accomplish. The 900 a.m. meeting with Captain Whitman and Ms. Davis is set, Richard confirmed, checking his tablet. They've both been informed it's a review of yesterday's incident, but they don't know you'll be there personally, William. William nodded. Good. I want their unfiltered reactions. Marcus, who had been quiet during much of the morning's discussion, finally spoke up. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish today? Dad, are you looking for them to admit they were wrong, to apologize, to be fired? The directness of the question hung in the air for a moment before William responded. What I want, he said carefully, is understanding. I want to know whether this was an isolated incident based on poor judgment or a symptom of a larger problem within Meridian's culture. The actions we take will depend on what we learn. Marcus considered this. And where do I fit into all this? Am I just there to be pointed at as the victim, or do I have a voice in the process? You have whatever role you want, William assured him. If you prefer to observe silently, that's fine. If you want to ask questions, that's fine too. This is as much your journey as mine. Marcus nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. I want to be heard, not just as your son, but as a person who experienced something that no passenger should have to endure. Understood, William said. Richard, can you make sure the conference room is set up to record? I want documentation of everything that's said already arranged, Richard confirmed. And I've put together files on both Whitman and Davis. Whitman has been with the company for 23 years. Excellent record. No previous incidents of this nature. Davis has been a flight attendant for 22 years also with a clean record. What about the other flight attendants on board? Marcus asked. The male attendant who came with the captain to remove me. Richard consulted his notes. James Patel, 8 years with Meridian. He was following the captain's orders, but will interview him separately this afternoon. William checked his watch. Our flight leaves in 90 minutes. Let's wrap this up and head to the airport. As they gathered their materials, Marcus paused. Dad, there was a passenger, an older woman who sat next to me on the flight. Her name was Elena. She tried to speak up for me. William looked up. Do you want us to try to contact her? Marcus considered the question. Not right now, but maybe later. She was the only one who said anything at all. The small acknowledgement of Elena's effort seemed important to Marcus, and William made a mental note to have Diane locate her information from the passenger manifest. As they prepared to leave for the airport, William placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Whatever happens today, I want you to know how proud I am of you. Not just for how you handled yesterday, but for your willingness to be part of making things right. Marcus nodded, his expression serious. Let's just make sure it actually makes a difference, not just for me, but for everyone who looks like me. The weight of that responsibility settled on William's shoulders as they headed for the car. Today was not just about addressing a single incident of discrimination. It was about beginning a process of examination and change that could reshape Meridian Air from the inside out. And it all hinged on what would happen in a conference room in Chicago in just a few hours. Captain Robert Whitman arrived at Meridian's Chicago headquarters 30 minutes before his scheduled meeting. His uniform immaculate as always, though he was not flying today. The corporate offices occupied several floors of a sleek downtown building with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city and Lake Michigan beyond. As he checked in at the security desk, he noticed Heather Davis already waiting in the lobby, her posture rigid, her expression tense. "Morning, Heather." He greeted her, keeping his tone professional. "Captain," she acknowledged with a nod. "Any idea what we're walking into?" Whitman shook his head. "Just that it's about yesterday's incident." "Have you prepared a statement? I documented everything last night," she confirmed. "Every observation, every action, all by the book." They rode the elevator to the executive floor in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the conference room designated for their meeting, they found it empty except for a young woman who introduced herself as an assistant from the legal department. "Captain Whitman, Miss Davis. Thank you for coming," she said. "The others will join shortly. Can I get you anything while you wait coffee water?" They both declined, taking seats on one side of the long conference table. The room was immaculately appointed with comfortable leather chairs, state-of-the-art presentation technology, and a breathtaking view of the lake. "I don't like this," Heather murmured once they were alone. "Legal department involvement usually means trouble." Whitman maintained his composure, though he privately shared her concern. "Let's not jump to conclusions. We followed protocols as we understood them." Before Heather could respond, the door opened and Richard Chen entered, followed by two people Whitman hadn't expected to see. William Johnson himself and the young man from yesterday's flight. Whitman and Heather immediately stood a reflexive response to the presence of the company's founder and CEO. Whitman had met Johnson a handful of times at company events and pilot meetings, but had never interacted with him directly in a situation like this. "Please sit," Johnson said, his deep voice filling the room as he took a seat across from them. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Richard Chen sat beside Johnson, while the young man Marcus Whitman now realized, recalling the name from yesterday's documentation, took a seat slightly apart, his expression carefully neutral. Captain Whitman Ms. Davis Johnson began, "I believe you've gathered that this meeting concerns the incident on Flight 2187 yesterday involving a passenger who was removed from the aircraft prior to departure." "Yes, sir." Whitman confirmed, his mouth suddenly dry. Johnson gestured toward Marcus. "That passenger was my son Marcus Johnson." The revelation hit Whitman like a physical blow. Beside him, he heard Heather's sharp intake of breath. In an instant, the context of the meeting shifted dramatically. We didn't know Whitman managed his mind racing to process this new information. "No, you didn't," Johnson agreed. "Marcus flies under his own name without special designations or treatment. He values his independence and privacy, as do I." There was a moment of tense silence before Johnson continued. "I want to be very clear about something. We are not here today because Marcus is my son. We are here because what happened yesterday raises serious concerns about our procedures, our training, and our culture. Had this happened to any passenger, it would warrant the same scrutiny." Whitman glanced at Richard Chen, whose expression revealed nothing. This was clearly not a standard operational review. "Sir," Whitman began carefully, "we acted according to security protocols. When a flight attendant reports concerns about a passenger's documentation or behavior, we're trained to on the side of caution." Johnson nodded. "I understand that, Captain, which is why I'd like to hear exactly what concerns were reported and why they warranted removing a passenger who had already cleared security and boarding verification." All eyes turned to Heather, who straightened in her chair. "Mr. Johnson, as I documented in my report, there were several factors that raised concerns." She began, her voice professional, but strained. "The passenger your son had purchased his ticket the day before the flight, which is a potential security flag. He had minimal luggage for someone claiming to be returning to university. And I observed what appeared to be nervous behavior during boarding." Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice calm, but firm. "What nervous behavior specifically?" Heather hesitated. "You seemed on edge, checking your phone frequently, scanning the cabin." "I was texting my roommate about weekend plans," Marcus replied evenly. "And looking for my seat like every other passenger," Whitman interjected, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "Ms. Davis followed proper procedure by reporting her concerns to me. As captain, I made the decision to have the passenger to have you, Mr. Johnson, removed for additional verification. And what verification was actually conducted after I was removed?" Marcus asked again, an uncomfortable pause. "We requested verification of your enrollment status at Westlake University," Whitman finally said. "Was that verification ever completed?" Johnson inquired. Whitman and Heather exchanged glances. "I am not certain," Whitman admitted. "Once a passenger is removed, security and customer service handle the follow-up processes. So you made a decision with significant impact on a passenger, but never followed through to confirm whether the concerns were valid." Johnson observed, his tone measured, but pointed. "The flight had a scheduled departure time to maintain," Whitman explained, though the justification sounded weak even to his own ears. Johnson turned to his son. "Marcus, is there anything you'd like to ask or say at this point?" Marcus looked directly at Heather, then at Whitman. "I want to know if either of you have considered the possibility that your assessment of my behavior and your decision to remove me were influenced by the fact that I'm a young black man." The question hung in the air, direct and unflinching. Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Heather's face flushed. "I treat all passengers the same," she said defensively. "This wasn't about race, wasn't it?" Marcus challenged. "How many white passengers with last-minute tickets and light luggage did you flag for additional screening yesterday? Did you question the business travelers with only briefcases, the college students returning from weekend trips with just backpacks?" Heather had no immediate response. Whitman attempted to redirect. "Mr. Johnson, Marcus, I can assure you that Meridian Air has strict policies against discrimination of any kind. Our decisions are based on security protocols, not racial profiling." Yet the outcome, William Johnson interjected, was that my son experienced what many would consider a textbook example of racial profiling. Whether that was the intent or not, it's difficult to ignore the pattern it fits into. Richard Chen, who had been quietly observing, now spoke. Captain Whitman, Miss Davis, I want to be very clear that this meeting is not disciplinary in nature, at least not at this stage. We're seeking to understand what happened and why, so we can address any underlying issues appropriately. However, Johnson added, what happens next will depend largely on your willingness to engage in honest self-reflection about yesterday's events. Whitman felt a mixture of relief and unease at Chen's clarification. They weren't being fired, at least not today. But this was clearly just the beginning of whatever process Johnson had in mind. What exactly are you asking of us, sir? Whitman inquired. Johnson leaned forward, his expression intense but not hostile. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that despite your best intentions and your commitment to treating everyone equally unconscious, biases may have influenced your perceptions and decisions yesterday. I'm asking you to be open to examining those biases not as an admission of deliberate wrongdoing, but as a step toward ensuring that what happened to Marcus doesn't happen to anyone else on a Meridian Air flight. There was a long silence as Whitman and Heather absorbed Johnson's words. Finally, Whitman spoke, his voice quieter than before. Mr. Johnson, I've been a pilot for over 25 years. Safety and fairness have always been my highest priorities. He paused, seeming to wrestle with his next words. But I'm willing to consider that there might be factors influencing my judgment that I'm not fully aware of. It was a small concession, but a significant one coming from a man of Whitman's experience and stature. Heather remained silent, her expression torn between defensiveness and uncertainty. Miss Davis, Johnson prompted gently. I stand by my assessment that there were concerning factors, she said firmly. But she glanced at Marcus, meeting his steady gaze. But I understand how it must have felt from your perspective, and I'm sorry for that. It wasn't a full acknowledgement of bias. But it was a start and opening that William Johnson clearly intended to build upon. Thank you both for your honesty, he said. This conversation is just the beginning. I've decided to initiate a comprehensive review of Meridian's training programs, security protocols, and corporate culture with a specific focus on identifying and addressing unconscious bias. Whitman and Heather exchanged alarmed glances. This was far bigger than a discussion about one incident. All Meridian employees from myself down will participate in this process, Johnson continued. I've already reached out to Michael Robinson, our former head of human resources, to help design and implement the initiative. The mention of Robinson's name clearly surprised Whitman. Michael Robinson, but he left the company under difficult circumstances. Yes, he did, Johnson acknowledged. Largely because the board and I weren't ready to implement the kind of changes he advocated for. That was a mistake on my part, one I intend to rectify. Richard Chen distributed folders to Whitman and Heather. These contain the details of the review process and your roles in it. You'll both be on administrative leave with pay for the next 2 weeks while participating in intensive training and consultation. Administrative leave? Heather repeated, her voice rising slightly. But that's usually for it's not disciplinary, Chen assured her. We need your full attention on this process without the demands of your regular duties. And after the 2 weeks, Whitman asked, that will depend on several factors. Johnson replied, your engagement with the process, the outcomes of the training, and the recommendations of the consultants. But my goal is not to lose experienced employees. It's to ensure that all Meridian staff have the awareness and tools they need to create a truly equitable experience for every passenger. As the meeting continued with Richard explaining the details of the review process, Marcus observed the shifting emotions on the faces of the captain and flight attendant, from shock to defensiveness to tentative acceptance. He wondered if any real change would come from this, or if it would ultimately be filed away as another corporate diversity initiative more focused on liability protection than genuine transformation. But looking at his father's determined expression, Marcus felt a cautious hope. William Johnson had built Meridian Air through sheer force of will and unwavering commitment to his vision. If he applied that same determination to addressing the company's cultural blind spots, perhaps something meaningful could emerge from yesterday's humiliation. For now, though, Marcus was simply grateful that his voice had been heard, that the captain and flight attendant had been forced to see him not as a security threat or a stereotype, but as a human being deserving of dignity and respect. It was a small victory, but perhaps a necessary first step toward the larger changes his father envisioned. Elena Bennett sat in her daughter's kitchen, staring at her phone in disbelief. The email from Meridian Air customer service had arrived just moments ago. Dear Ms. Bennett *, thank you for your feedback regarding Flight 2187 on April 1st. We take all customer concerns seriously, especially those involving our commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect. Your description of the incident involving the removal of a passenger has been forwarded to senior management for immediate review. We would like to speak with you directly about your observations if you are willing. Please contact us at the number below at your earliest convenience. Sincerely * Customer Relations Team, Meridian Air. Attached to the email was a direct number, not the standard customer service line. Elena had sent her complaint less than 24 hours ago, expecting at best a form letter acknowledging receipt. This rapid personalized response suggested her account had triggered significant concern within the company. Sarah, she called to her daughter, who was working on her laptop in the living room. Something's happening with that airline complaint I filed. Sarah joined her mother in the kitchen, reading the email over her shoulder. Wow, that was fast. Are you going to call them? Absolutely. Elena replied, already dialing the number. The call was answered on the second ring by a woman who introduced herself as Diane, executive assistant to William Johnson. Eleanor's confusion must have been evident in her voice because Diane quickly explained, Mr. Johnson is the founder and CEO of Meridian Air. He's personally reviewing what happened on Flight 2187 yesterday, and he was very interested in your account of the incident. I see, Elena said, trying to process this information. I'm happy to provide any details that might help. Actually, Miss Bennett, Mr. Johnson would like to know if you'd be willing to meet with him in person. He's currently in Chicago and could arrange for a car to bring you to our offices this afternoon if that's convenient. Elena was momentarily speechless. The CEO of an airline wanted to meet with her about a complaint she had filed just hours ago. It seemed extraordinary until a possibility occurred to her. This is about the young man, isn't it, Marcus? Was he someone important? There was a slight pause before Diane replied carefully. Mr. Johnson can explain the situation more fully in person. Would 2 p.m. work for your schedule? Eleanor looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, 2 p.m. would be fine. Should I bring anything or anyone, just yourself and your recollections of what you observed? Diane assured her. A car will pick you up at 1:30. If you could text this number with your current address, we'll make the arrangements. After ending the call, Elena sat back, her mind racing. They're sending a car, Sarah. The CEO wants to meet with me about what happened on that flight. Sarah looked both impressed and concerned. This is bigger than you thought, isn't it? Do you think Marcus might have been related to someone at the airline? I don't know, Elena admitted, but I'm going to find out. By early afternoon, the news had begun to spread throughout Meridian Air's corporate headquarters. Something significant was happening involving William Johnson himself, a passenger incident, and a major new initiative focused on addressing bias within the company. In a small conference room down the hall from where the morning's meeting had taken place, Marcus sat alone collecting his thoughts. The confrontation with Captain Whitman and Heather Davis had been draining, bringing back all the emotions of the previous day. But it had also been empowering to speak his truth directly to those responsible, to watch them struggle to justify actions that in the clear light of hindsight were difficult to defend. A knock at the door interrupted his reflections. It was his father. How are you holding up? William asked, taking a seat across from him. I'm okay, Marcus assured him. It was intense but necessary, I think. William nodded. Richard is meeting with Whitman and Davis, now going over the details of their temporary reassignment and the training program. They're both shaken, but I think at least Whitman is beginning to understand the gravity of what happened. And Heather? William sighed. She's more defensive. It may take longer for her to recognize her own biases, but the process will help even if she resists initially. Marcus studied his father, noting the lines of fatigue around his eyes. This is going to be a lot of work, isn't it? Changing an entire corporate culture? Yes, William acknowledged, and it won't happen overnight, but it has to start somewhere. He paused, then added, "We're meeting with Elena Bennett at 2:00 p.m. She filed a detailed complaint about what she witnessed yesterday." Diane tracked her down from the passenger manifest. Marcus straightened Elena, the woman who sat next to me. The very same. She was quite specific in her description of how you were treated, and she made it clear that she believed racial bias was a factor. She tried to speak up for me on the plane, Marcus remembered. Not very forcefully, but she did say something when everyone else was silent. "Would you like to be part of the meeting with her?" William asked. Marcus considered the question. "Yes, I would. I'd like to thank her, if nothing else." William nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "There's something else we need to discuss, Marcus, about your role in all this going forward." "What do you mean? Michael Robinson is arriving tomorrow to begin designing the comprehensive review process. He suggested, and I agree, that we should consider creating a formal position for someone to oversee the initiative and ensure it doesn't lose momentum over time." Marcus began to see where this was heading. "And you're thinking that person could be me?" "Only if it's something you want," William said carefully. "You're in the middle of your education, and this wasn't part of your plans. I wouldn't ask you to derail your studies for this." "What kind of position are you envisioning?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. "Something like Director of Equity and Inclusion Initiatives," William suggested. "Reporting directly to me with authority to implement changes across all departments. It would be part-time initially, allowing you to continue your studies with the potential to become full-time after graduation if you were interested." Marcus leaned back, considering the proposal. It was an extraordinary opportunity, a chance to make real meaningful change within a major corporation. "And yet, I'm not sure I'm qualified," he admitted. "I'm only a sophomore dad. I don't have a degree in organizational behavior or diversity management. There are professionals with years of experience who could do this more effectively." "You'd work closely with Michael and other consultants," William explained. "Your academic background in political science and African American studies is relevant. But more importantly, you have the personal experience and perspective that many of those professionals lack. You understand what it feels like to be profiled, to be treated as suspect because of your appearance. That insight is invaluable." Marcus was still hesitant. Would people take me seriously, or would they just see me as the boss's son, who got a cushy job because of nepotism? William smiled slightly. "Some might at first, but I suspect they'd change their minds once they worked with you." His expression grew more serious. "Think about it, Marcus. No pressure, but consider what you might accomplish with the platform and resources of Meridian behind you." Before Marcus could respond, there was another knock at the door. It was Diane. "Ms. Bennett has arrived," she announced. "She's waiting in the main conference room." William stood. "Thank you, Diane. We'll be right there." He turned to Marcus. Ready, Marcus nodded, pushing aside the weighty career decision for the moment. Right now, he wanted to focus on thanking the one person who had tried however tentatively to stand up for him when it mattered. Eleanor Bennett had never been inside corporate headquarters quite as impressive as Meridian Air's Chicago offices. The sleek modern architecture and panoramic views were a far cry from the public school administrative buildings where she had spent most of her career. The executive assistant who had greeted her in the lobby, Diane, she recalled, had been gracious and professional, escorting her to a plush conference room and offering refreshments while she waited. Elena wasn't entirely sure why she had been summoned with such urgency. Her complaint, while detailed and strongly worded, had been just one of what must be thousands the airline received regularly. What made this incident special enough to warrant the CEO's personal attention? The door opened and two men entered, one older, distinguished, looking in an expensive suit, the other much younger and instantly recognizable. "Marcus!" Elena exclaimed, rising from her seat in surprise. "Hello, Elena." Marcus greeted her with a warm smile. "It's good to see you again under better circumstances." The older man stepped forward, extending his hand. "Miss Bennett, I'm William Johnson, CEO of Meridian Air. Thank you for coming on such short notice." Elena shook his hand, her mind racing to connect the dots. "Mr. Johnson, are you related to Marcus?" "He's my father," Marcus confirmed as they all took seats around the conference table. Oh, Eleanor's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "That explains, well, quite a lot, actually." William nodded. "Yes, though, I want to be clear that our response to this incident isn't solely because Marcus is my son. What happened yesterday raises serious concerns about our procedures and culture that would warrant attention regardless of who was involved." "I'm just grateful you filed that complaint," Marcus added. "It means a lot that you took the time to speak up." Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment. "I should have done more on the plane. I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I only offered token objections. I've been kicking myself ever since." "You did more than anyone else," Marcus said gently. Everyone else just watched in silence. William leaned forward. "Miss Bennett, your perspective as a witness is valuable to us. Would you mind sharing your recollections of the incident, what you observed, and why you felt it was inappropriate?" For the next 20 minutes, Elena recounted the events from her perspective, how she had been chatting pleasantly with Marcus about his studies, how the flight attendant had appeared, and begun questioning him how the situation had escalated until he was eventually removed from the flight. "It was crystal clear to me that he was being singled out because he was a young black man," she concluded firmly. "There was no legitimate security concern that I could discern. He was polite, articulate, clearly a student, as he said. The whole thing felt profoundly unjust." William listened intently, occasionally making notes. And after the flight, what was the reaction among the other passengers? Ella sighed, mostly uncomfortable silence. A few people murmured that it seemed unnecessary, but most just seemed relieved that the situation was resolved and the flight could depart. It was that collective relief that bothered me almost as much as the incident itself. This unspoken assumption that removing the black passenger had somehow made everyone safer. Marcus nodded in recognition of this dynamic one he had experienced in various forms throughout his life. Ms. Bennett Williams said, "We're implementing a comprehensive review of our training programs and procedures in response to this incident. Your observations will be valuable in shaping that process. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement that could be used in our training materials?" "Of course," Elena agreed readily. "Anything I can do to help prevent something like this from happening again." William explained the broader initiative he was launching, the involvement of external consultants, the examination of security protocols, the company-wide training on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. "It's an ambitious undertaking," Eleanor observed when he had finished, and an admirable one. Most companies would have issued a generic apology and moved on. Most companies aren't led by someone directly affected by the issue, Marcus pointed out with a glance at his father. William acknowledged this with a nod. "True, but this incident has highlighted blind spots in our corporate culture that I should have addressed long ago. Sometimes it takes a personal connection to make us see what should have been obvious all along." For the next hour, they discussed specific changes that might prevent similar incidents in the future. Clearer guidelines for when additional verification was warranted, accountability measures for decisions to remove passengers, better training for flight crews on recognizing and mitigating bias. As the meeting drew to a close, Elena turned to Marcus. "May I ask what you're studying at Westlake?" "We never got to finish our conversation on the plane." "Political science with a minor in African American studies," Marcus replied. Elena smiled. "Perfect preparation for helping transform corporate culture, I'd say." William raised an eyebrow. "That's actually something we've been discussing. I've offered Marcus a position overseeing our equity initiatives, though he's concerned about his qualifications." "Qualifications?" Eleanor repeated with a hint of amusement. "Young man, you have the most important qualification of all lived experience combined with the education to put that experience in context. Don't underestimate the value of that perspective." Marcus seemed surprised by her vehemence. You think I could actually make a difference in a corporate environment? I spent 40 years in education. Elena told him, I've seen how systems resist change, how biases become embedded in institutional practices, but I've also seen how the right person in the right position can transform those systems from within. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. If you're given the opportunity to be that person, Marcus, I hope you'll consider it seriously. As Elena prepared to leave, William had one more question for her. I'm curious, Miss Bennett. What motivated you to file such a detailed complaint? Many people might have felt uncomfortable about what they witnessed, but few would have taken the time to document it so thoroughly. Eleanor considered the question carefully. I've spent my life in education, Mr. Johnson, trying to create environments where all students could thrive regardless of their background. I've seen firsthand how bias, often unconscious, can limit opportunities and damage potential. What I witnessed on that plane was a textbook example of the kind of discrimination I've fought against throughout my career. She paused, then added more softly, and perhaps I felt I needed to do more since I hadn't done enough in the moment. William nodded in understanding. Well, your action has contributed to what I hope will be meaningful change at Meridian. Thank you. As Diane escorted Elena to the waiting car, Marcus and William remained in the conference room contemplating the conversation. She's quite remarkable, William observed. Yes, Marcus agreed. The kind of ally who doesn't just talk about doing the right thing, but actually does it. He was quiet for a moment, then added, I've been thinking about your offer. William turned to his son, his expression attentive, but neutral, careful not to reveal his own hopes. I'd like to try, Marcus said simply. Not full-time. I need to finish my degree, but if you're serious about creating this position, about giving me real authority to implement changes, then yes, I want to be part of it. William felt a surge of pride and satisfaction. I'm serious, Marcus. This won't be a figurehead position or a PR gesture. You'll have resources support and my full backing to make substantive changes. Then let's do it, Marcus decided. Let's make Meridian Air the kind of company where what happened to me yesterday becomes unthinkable. The commitment hung in the air between them, father and son, CEO and future executive, united in purpose despite their different paths. It was a beginning, not an end, the first step in what would likely be a long and challenging journey toward institutional change. But as William looked at his son's determined expression, he felt a certainty that had eluded him since that first phone call in the airport terminal. Together, they would transform Meridian Air, and in doing so, perhaps they would create a model that other organizations could follow, a blueprint for addressing the subtle systemic biases that had persisted far too long in corporate America. It would not be easy. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But William Johnson had never shied away from a challenge, and neither, it seemed, had his son. 3 months later, Marcus Johnson stood at the podium in Meridian Air's largest conference center, facing an audience of over 200 company executives, managers, and training personnel. Behind him, a large screen displayed the newly created logo for the Equity in the Air initiative, a stylized horizon with the words safety, integrity, respect, excellence, accountability arrayed beneath it. At 20, Marcus was by far the youngest person in the room to hold a director-level position. Yet as he prepared to address this gathering of seasoned professionals, he felt a calm confidence that had grown steadily during the intensive months of preparation leading to this moment. Good morning, he began, his voice strong and clear. 3 months ago, I boarded a Meridian Air flight as a passenger and was removed under circumstances that many of you are now familiar with. Today, I stand before you not as a victim of that incident, but as the Director of Equity and Inclusion Initiatives, a position created in its aftermath. From the front row, William Johnson watched his son with undisguised pride. Beside him sat Richard Chen, Michael Robinson, and Eleanor Bennett, who had accepted an invitation to join the advisory board for the initiative. The easy path following that incident would have been to discipline the individuals involved and move on. Marcus continued. Many organizations would have considered that sufficient. But Meridian Air, under my father's leadership, chose a more challenging but ultimately more meaningful response to examine the system's practices and unspoken assumptions that allowed such an incident to occur in the first place. He gestured to the screen where the presentation shifted to show the comprehensive program they had developed over the past 3 months. Today marks the official launch of our Equity in the Air initiative, a multi-year commitment to transforming Meridian's approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion at every level of operations. This isn't a one-time sensitivity training or a superficial policy adjustment. It's a fundamental reimagining of how we recruit, train, promote, and operate as an organization. For the next 45 minutes, Marcus outlined the specifics of the initiative revised security protocols that required clear objective criteria for additional passenger screening, comprehensive bias training for all customer F-facing staff, new hiring practices designed to increase diversity at all levels, and most significantly, a structural reorganization that embedded equity considerations into every major decision-making process. This work isn't about political correctness or public relations, Marcus emphasized as he approached his conclusion. It's about living up to the core values that have guided Meridian since its founding. Safety, integrity, respect, excellence, and accountability. When we fail to recognize and address our biases, we compromise each of those values. From her seat in the front row, Elena nodded in agreement, thinking of the many conversations she had had with Marcus and William over the past 3 months as they developed the initiative. At 72, she had found an unexpected new chapter in her career, bringing her decades of experience in educational equity to the corporate world. I want to acknowledge 2 people whose actions on Flight 2187 catalyzed this initiative, Marcus said, his tone shifting. Captain Robert Whitman and Flight Attendant Heather Davis are here today. They've spent the past 3 months engaged in intensive reflection and training, serving as consultants on our revised protocols and helping us understand how bias can influence decision-making even among well-intentioned professionals. At a table near the back of the room, Whitman and Davis sat with mixed expressions of discomfort and determination. Their journey over the past months had not been easy. Confronting their own biases, recognizing patterns in their decision-making they had never before acknowledged, and ultimately becoming reluctant but committed advocates for the changes being implemented. Captain Whitman will now join me to discuss the specific revisions to our security protocols. Marcus announced as Whitman rose and made his way to the podium. As the captain approached, there was a moment, brief but significant, when he and Marcus exchanged a look of mutual recognition. They would never be friends exactly. Too much stood between them for that, but they had developed a working relationship based on a shared commitment to preventing future incidents like the one that had brought them together. William watched this exchange with satisfaction. The past 3 months had been challenging, with resistance from some board members and executives who saw the initiative as an overreaction to a single incident. But William had stood firm, backed by Richard's legal expertise and Michael's organizational insights. And at the center of it all had been Marcus balancing his new responsibilities with his continued studies, bringing fresh perspectives to entrenched problems, and gradually earning the respect of even the most skeptical executives through his thoughtful, evidence-based approach. As Marcus and Whitman outlined the new security protocols, which emphasized objective criteria and accountability measures, William reflected on how this crisis had ultimately strengthened both Meridian Air and his relationship with his son. They had always been close, but there had been a certain distance as Marcus forged his own path separate from the family business. Now they were partners in a shared mission, their different perspectives and experiences combining to create something neither could have accomplished alone. The presentation concluded with a question and answer session, during which Marcus handled even the most challenging inquiries with poise and clarity. When the formal program ended, William made his way to the podium where Marcus was gathering his notes. "That was impressive," William told him quietly. "You've won over even the skeptics, I think." Marcus smiled. "Not all of them, but enough to make a start." "More than a start," William corrected. "This is already changing Meridian in ways I hadn't anticipated. The conversations happening across departments, the new ideas coming forward. It's remarkable. We've got a long way to go, Marcus cautioned. Changing policies is relatively easy. Changing mindsets takes longer. True, William acknowledged. But I'm more confident than ever that we're on the right path. Across the room, Elena was engaged in conversation with Heather Davis, an unlikely connection that had developed during the initiative's planning phase. Heather's initial defensiveness had gradually given way to genuine reflection, particularly after several long discussions with Elena about the subtle ways bias manifests in everyday interactions. It's still uncomfortable, Heather was admitting having to question impulses and reactions I've never examined before, but I'm beginning to understand why it's necessary. Eleanor nodded in understanding. Growth is always uncomfortable, but you've shown remarkable courage in being willing to learn from this experience rather than just trying to put it behind you. As attendees began to disperse, Marcus found himself approached by a young flight attendant he hadn't met before. "Mr. Johnson," she said, extending her hand. "I just wanted to thank you for what you're doing. I've experienced some of the same biases you described, though, from the other side of the uniform. It means a lot to see the company taking these issues seriously." "Thank you," Marcus replied, genuinely touched by her words. "That's exactly why this initiative matters. It's not just about passenger experiences. It's about creating an environment where everyone at Meridian feels valued and respected." As the room emptied, Marcus gathered his materials and prepared to head back to his office, a small but significant space near his father's, on the executive floor. He had a meeting with the training development team in an hour, and then a video call with his Westlake professors to discuss his independent study project, which had been modified to incorporate his work at Meridian. His life had changed dramatically since that humiliating moment on Flight 2187, taking a turn he could never have anticipated. The painful experience had been transformed into purpose, the injustice into opportunity for meaningful change. As he walked through Meridian's headquarters, nodding to colleagues who now greeted him with respect rather than curiosity, Marcus reflected on his father's words from months ago. Productive anger fuels change. Destructive anger just burns bridges you might need later. He had found that productive channel for his anger, that constructive path forward. And while no single initiative could eradicate the deep-seated biases that permeated society, Meridian Air was taking steps that few corporations had attempted, moving beyond token diversity efforts toward genuine structural change. It was a beginning, and sometimes Marcus thought as he opened the door to his office and prepared for the work ahead. Beginnings were the most important part of any journey.